We didn't know what we would be expecting, but we're so grateful for some of you here who are friends of ours, friends at the museum, and that we are grateful that we can be here with CJ, who's really been the brainchild of this Idlewild series together with Holland Museum, and to be here as we reach the culmination of the exhibit, the culmination of this journey. But it's not the end. We trust that it is the beginning, and it is also why it is so fitting that we're ending with planning and design in mind. That's a different lens in which to look at history, and one that allows us to appreciate history as a way of projecting into the future, as a way of honoring the past, but also then embracing the possibilities that the community wants and ways in which we can continue to honor them. So with that, tonight, as you can tell, I'm starting off because my role tonight is really more of a moderator. These are the three experts of the communities here, experts in historic preservation planning, experts in architecture, and my role really is that of a facilitator, which I usually do in my work. And with that, we also want to take a step back and really look at why historic preservation planning as well as community planning matters. Why this is such an appropriate way to close the end, to share a little bit more with you about what that is, but not really dwell too much on it. To use that as a lens to look at how historic community planning and preservation and stewardship has occurred in Idlewild from the past to the present, and then ending with what's next. What's next for Idlewild, but also what's next for many other resort communities of African American heritage, amongst others, and the whole network and systems that Dr. Fred Johnson had shared with you a couple of weeks ago, and what that means really as you look at the broader story of this nation. And so with that, that's our goal tonight, and we'll continue to bounce the mic as well as different segments of the sharing and conversation, and really just a roundtable dialogue that we hope to have with each other and with you. Please feel free to stop us if you have any questions at any time, but we really want to start by contextualizing the history of what Idlewild means. And as you look at this map, which is from 1942, there are a couple of places that are called out in Michigan. It doesn't say Idlewild, it says Bitely, Ann Arbor, and Detroit. Those have been places of refuge, of leisure, as well as respite. It's also about the histories of not just Americans, if not just African Americans, but we're also honoring the rich tapestry of others who are then welcomed into these places of refuge. We also want to acknowledge that it's not just Black history, it's histories of whites, of others who are welcomed into the mix, that were mixed households, mixed families, that found their way to have a safe haven in places where they were not necessarily welcome. And so that's kind of where we start our journey with Bitely. And Bitely ties us really to two different communities that we'll see, and kind of why and how we all came together in this kind of unique constellation. So exactly 1 year ago, Nick, Anna, and I were sitting where you were sitting, and CJ was up here sharing a little bit about Idlewild, and that really was the beginning of our friendship together, but also a professional journey into community involvement with Idlewild and the other community that you see here, Woodland Park. Thanks. It's a special message. And what happened 1 year ago was the Right Place, an economic development agency that's really based in West Michigan, in Grand Rapids, and covers almost 15 different counties, had put out a proposal asking for teams with historic preservation planning backgrounds, with community planning backgrounds, to provide a proposal in response to the stewardship of these two communities, Woodland Park and Idlewild, funded by the Fremont Area Community Foundation. This has been a highly collaborative process where we then found CJ through his presentation over here and wondered if CJ would then be that bridge to the community that we would be working with. And you would probably understand why we would need a local bridge to that community. We are all local Hollanders. We live here. We've not spent time up in Woodland Park. We've not spent time in Idlewild. It's a whole different set of histories that we want to be able to sensitively navigate and to honor. And who better than one of the best products to come out of Idlewild and extension. And I want to quote and acknowledge that quote to somebody sitting right behind you in the last row, because that's what your reputation is, CJ. You're one of the best things that came out of there, and you continue to be one of the best things and best people to champion it. So with that, we want to honor you and to thank you for the way in which you've helped us come alongside and be a part of these two communities. And so with that, those two communities really had an intertwined history. Idlewild was a more nationally known community. It drew 25,000 over people. Holland Park was the quietest sister to it. And that continues to be the case today, where both are in the setting of the National Manistee Forest, both lakefront resort communities, and both really reached the peak of their flourishing and existence from the 1920s all the way to the 1960s. It's one in which we then were asked to achieve a couple of things through the process, and one that we really just want to start with understanding why it matters to have historic community planning, preservation, and stewardship being tied into this, and why an economic development agency was involved. And so, as we take a step back, and before we dive into what exactly happened in Idlewild Park, we really just want to maybe tap into Nick and really his experience both teaching about historic preservation planning, historic conservation, and him being a local historic district commission in terms of why the heritage and the preservation of the heritage is so important on a philosophical scale.
Thanks. Yeah, on a philosophical scale, there are several ways to go about it or come at it, but it's important that you noted that the RFP came from this economic development organization. So what does that mean? Which strings might be attached when somebody sets out to initiate economic development activities around something that could have value and produce value because of its history, because of the stories and the heritage there. And we are operating within Michigan and within the United States, and there's a vast framework that exists within the National Park Service and other organizations such as the National Trust for Historic Preservation that provide lots of helpful language and tools and guidance as in terms of reckoning with the economic development sort of aims and goals and the historic stewardship of a place or a thing. And because you're a museum crowd, we thought we would also bring in a lens that's an international lens. It's the UNESCO lens. And in July of 2023, actually, the United States rejoined UNESCO and raised its flag at UNESCO. So this pertains to us as Americans and kind of comes alongside the National Park Service parameters for these things. But when you're going back to the idea of economic development, when you're treading into that territory, you want to be really careful, and you want to understand how can you be sensitive to the thing, to the resource, or to the thing that has that history and heritage, so that you don't accidentally damage it or destroy it or cause unforeseen consequences. And so UNESCO lays out some helpful language for that. The first thing that's quite helpful in a situation like this is it provides a definition of an idea or a concept called intangible cultural heritage. And one of the things that's true in Idlewild and in Woodland Park, but it's really kind of present everywhere, is that somewhere between the built fabric and the artifacts and the collections and things like that, and then the natural setting, the nature of the forest, and the waterways and things like that, there's this whole assemblage that is a sense of place, something that people associate themselves with, or maybe hang their hat on and take an identity from. And it can include lots of different things. It kind of doesn't have specific boundaries, but it's very open to interpretation, so that the people being served by projects like this can adapt it to their uses. But it provides a definition, which is a specific definition here, and it says intangible cultural heritage means the practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, as well as the instruments, objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces associated therewith that communities, groups, and in some cases individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage. I won't read the whole thing, but it's this great concept that lots of things can fill in, and it helps us round out a fuller story than if we were just talking about physical things. It lists a few things that it could include. These are not all the things that it can include, but these are a few. Oral traditions and expressions, including language as a vehicle of the intangible cultural heritage. Performing arts, social practices, rituals, and festive events. So we would say tulip time here in Holland, is part of one of those things that comprises some of our cultural heritage here. Knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe, traditional craftsmanship. And then this definition at the bottom is the definition of safeguarding that UNESCO uses, which is very similar to stewardship, but it's a very specific understanding of how one goes about looking after this idea here, please. Could you go to the next slide? Okay. So, because you're a museum audience, we're giving you a little bit of a deeper treatment in these things. This is a subsection of something called the basic texts from UNESCO that deal at a very deep level with intangible cultural heritage. And this specific section lays out the ethical principles for safeguarding intangible cultural heritage. And there's some selections here that I won't dwell on for very long, but I just want to kind of point out a couple things. So it's recognizing that it's dynamic and living. So the dynamic and living nature of intangible cultural heritage should be continuously respected. Authenticity and exclusivity should not constitute concerns and obstacles in the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage. This one deals with threats. So communities, groups, and where applicable, individuals should play a significant role in determining what constitutes threats to their intangible cultural heritage. Okay, so you got to be careful what you wish for, right? If you go too far in one direction, let's say towards tourism, like we're gonna really hang our hat on tourism. We're gonna reinvent ourselves around this idea of tourism as a vehicle of economic development. When does that become something that might become a threat to the cultural heritage that exists before that? And then this last one is a little. Can you get that? When I touch this. Okay. All right. I'll read really slowly. So that the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage is of general interest to humanity. Okay, that's the thing that I want to emphasize here, is that it's a very specific interest to specific groups when it deals with those groups and the places that belong to those groups. When we look upstairs at the Dutch Gallery, there's some connection to our heritage here in Holland that concerns us in a specific way as members of Holland. But there's something there too that's also of general interest to all of humanity. And it's our humanity that connects us and makes it appropriate for us to be interested in these things, even if we're not a member of that group, right? And so this is one of those ethics that's laid out and really kind of gives us somewhere in there a basis for why we should all care about places like Idlewild and right? There are many layers where we can find that basis. We can find that basis as Michiganders, we can find that basis as museum people or as people who went up north when we were kids. And then there are specific communities and members of those communities that have much more rich layers of why they are concerned with those places. But all of humanity actually has, it's appropriate for all of humanity to have some general interest in these topics. Right, excellent. This is from a different international body, not UNESCO, but a charter that was laid out by this group called ICOMOS in 2011. And it brings the idea of intangible cultural heritage into a physical realm and deals with the idea of historic towns and urban areas. Now, Idlewild and Woodland Park, they are not urban areas. They are historic settings. We could debate on whether they are towns or whether they are resort settings and things like that. But nevertheless, this deals with the physicality of the place. And it talks about what it understands as tangible and what it understands as intangible. And it talks about how really this safeguarding of this place is a mashup of both the tangible and the intangible. And then there's another selection here that we just set here because it does hit on that tourism threat as one specific threat, although there are others as well.
You can say that we're trying to be informal.
We're trying to be informal.
Nothing was rehearsed.
Nick, that's so important, and thank you for that. Why does it matter? Specifically Idlewild. Can I just, so I've been thinking about this, I've been rehearsing this, and Ricky, Michelle, Sean, thank you for allowing me to share my love. Because what you did was you created a monster. So I had to think, why is this important? Why is it important now in history, like today? When I talk about Idlewild and what it could be, and maybe even what it should be, I first want to say, because this is recorded and people will hear it, I'm speaking as Christopher James Grier. I also am the historian of Yates Township and Idlewild, and I also sit on the Planning Commission as the chair of the Planning Department. So I want to be crystal clear when people listen to this and they hear me speak, it is the particular lens that I'm speaking from today. I'm not speaking from either two of those, although that's my background. That's my, for whoever's listening, that's my NDA. When I think about Idlewild, I think like, why is it important today? Well, we're not in Jim Crow, right? Because that's where it came out of. It came out of a very violent time. It came out of a time of intentional degradation, right after a time of reconstructing, after a time of saying we're sorry for the atrocities we've committed and we're going to do better. And then it wound up in a time that created Idlewild during the Jim Crow era. We're not in that time. Not really. And I'm not going to speak to that today, but that's another lecture for another time. What I will speak to is that her importance is this. Let me give you the 11 chapters of the second book that I'm into writing. Healing Hands, Idlewild and Black Medicine. I Too Sing America, Idlewild and Black Veterans. Natural Women, the leading women of Idlewild. Let's Have Church, the spirituality of the Black churches in the greater Idlewild community. Good food, good meat, good God, let's eat. The Table and the restaurants, tea rooms, and the food for purchase ways of Idlewild. The Green Book and Idlewild's places listed in it. Celebrate good times. Come, celebrate good times, right? All of these actually have a song with them, so sometimes you might hear that song. The nightclubs, the bars, and the nightlife of Idlewild. Teach me the educational profiles in Black school teachers, administrators, educational professionals in the greater Idlewild area, and there were a significant number. Commerce, Black businesses, some over 350 businesses peppered the Black Eden. The musicians and entertainers who inspired us in hope, happiness, and holiness. High society, organizational clubs, lodges, cliques, oh my. All of those in and of themselves are specifically about Idlewild, and they tell stories and they give antidotes. They are instructional because they teach about entrepreneurship. They teach about community building and community development. They teach about what it means to be a village, what it means to raise. It teaches about cultural dissonance, those who have and those who have not, the educational and the economic divide, even in the 12s and the 20s and the 30s and the 60s and the 70s and the 90s. All of these stories of Idlewild are instructive, and they happen to be about Black people. But the truth of the matter is the essence of them can build you up. They have the capacity to transform your mind, re-paradigm, allow you to see and hear another way. Why is it important? Because those stories, those antidotes, those lessons, and those practices are tangible and transferable. So it's not just a has-been. It's not just, we should keep it around and remember it because Aretha Franklin was there, Joe Louis was there, Nora Zille Hurston was there, W.E.B. Du Bois owned property there, Madam C.J. Walker, her homestead is right on Fond du Lac and Lake Drive. Louis Armstrong is about 8 houses down the street from C.J.'s home where he grew up in. Those are incidentals. The importance goes well beyond that. And you have the sensationalism of Paradise Club and the Flamingo Club, which is still standing. You have the profound Polk's skating rink, which was the original building, Idlewild Clubhouse, which is no longer there on the island. But you also have the El Morocco, which is still standing. So you have these things, these places, you have cottages, and you have mid-century modern schools. So you have architectural things, and don't get me on the natural things, the ecological importance of why we need to maintain the Manistee National Forest, even though the Branch, Lemon, and Wright families purchased a logged 2,700 acres to create, white guys, to create a resort for Blacks in the midst of that. That's just the tip of the iceberg of why Idlewild and her history and her presence are not only important, but are, I think, obligatory to preserve and to share, which is why I devoted such amount of time of my own resources and the blessings of gifts from people who have said, you know, I got these pictures, you know, I got this menu. This is why it's important and why I leave. Did I hear? You want to say anything else? Okay, she said it.
But hearing from that community as well as personal perspective, it's also kind of why we want to contextualize this internally in Idlewild, but also as part of that national system that Dr. Fred Johnson had talked about. But it's also one that allows us to pivot in hearing what CJ has described, which was really in the heyday of the 1912 to 1960s, and really what came after and what is still part of this living community. It's really important to remember that this is not just a past. There may be some fragments of the past, but this is a place where people return to, where people gather, where they celebrate, and it's generations after generations. So with that, I'd like to turn to Anna to kind of walk us through a little bit and to give you all a little snapshot on where it came from and where we are right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Har Ye. So, as you can see in front of you, we have a bit of a timeline here that's looking at both what we in historic preservation would call the period of significance for Idlewild, so 1912 through 1960s, you've been hearing us say that, and then also looking ahead towards today, what initiatives have been started in preservation in order to keep these memories alive and to keep everything growing, because like we keep saying, it's still a vibrant community, and a vibrant community that's definitely very rooted in how it began. And so that's one reason of many that this has been such a great place to learn from and to be involved with. So we've talked about sort of that period of time where everything is at its peak, and then the slow decline, at least when we think of sort of the population numbers, the businesses in the area. In 1979, Idlewild was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. That's pretty early as far as sites being listed. The 1970s is when we really see that program taking off in America. It was started in the 60s. And so Idlewild right away is one of those sites. And something that I think is very interesting is that the National Register is typically very tied to structures. It's an architecture sort of focus, and Idlewild has its structures, but it also has that intangible, that natural history. And so a place that has both of these being represented so early, you know something special is going on there. And we'll have a map in just a second that shows you that in 2010, here we go. So you can see the original boundaries of that National Register nomination. It's the dashed lines up here. And those boundaries were actually expanded in 2010. So there's been recent work done as well to sort of fully, more fulfillingly telling the story of Idlewild and making sure all of these places are recognized. So the National Register, that's federal recognition. There's also been initiatives done at the state level, engagement plans, feasibility studies, rehabilitation and new investment on the local level. You can see a historic marker there. We'll again talk about that a little bit more later. But if you've had the chance to visit Idlewild, you'll see these around. There's various styles, smaller markers, larger markers on the landscape, and they again just begin to tell the story. Next slide. All right. Anything else you'd like me to add, Har Ye?
No, part of that too, Anna, is perhaps one where we can dwell a little bit more in terms of the 2020s.
Oh, the 2020s. I missed where we are right now, guys. So right now, in the community of Idlewild, you're undergoing, and CJ I think can speak more to this as well, a strategic plan development, a master plan update. So thinking at those bigger planning for the future, both the community historically, but then also how it's functioning today, how it can serve the members who are living there. And this is happening at the same time as the historic community planning work that we're doing. So I know that in our process, we've been trying to be conscious of these interworking parts and making sure that they can feed into each other. And like we mentioned at the beginning, it was the right place who brought us all together, thinking about economic development and that how that can be bolstered by what we've been doing here.
And I thank you for acknowledging that when people talk about Idlewild, they talk about its declination, its decline. And I usually bite my tongue, right? And which is the same thing I do when I talk about churches. I don't say they're dying, I'd say they're diminishing. And so I appreciate you giving the clear distinction of less businesses and less people, because the community is still vibrant. And not only is the community still vibrant, but if you come up there at certain parts of the year, you will ask the question, oh, this is heavy. There's a picture that I should have sent. I didn't think about that. When there was a couple times during the 50s and 60s that there were so many people there that they had to call the National Guard in. I'm coming back to 2020, guys. Right? 25,000 people. The reason I think it was so early was not just because because it is still currently the largest black resort landmass in the country, 2,700 acres. The other piece, when you look at a number of the other resorts around the country, usually they are for summer. People close up things and they go, and during the year there's very little activity. There's a lot of activity in terms of there's still people there, there's still schools there, there's churches there. As a matter of fact, the church that I was born, raised, and baptized in, you'll see in the exhibit if you haven't already, celebrated 100 years, August 23rd, this past August 23rd. That's one of the things that set it apart from resorts that are older than Idlewild, right? It was meant to be a year-round community. It was meant to offer recreation and resort. And so in this picture, it gives a glimpse of this past summer and some of the things that you could do and some of the places you could go, including some jazz and music festivals. And Fashion Week, absolutely. They actually just had closing of the cottage this past weekend. Closing of the cottage, as you can imagine, is for those who had summer homes in Idlewild. Those were usually the ones who traveled from the metropolitans: Detroit, Chicago Idlewilders, St. Louis Idlewilders, Cleveland Idlewilders, Detroit Idlewilders, Chicago Idlewilders, that would come up and then they would close their cottage. Well, the idea was you still had food in your pantries. And so they would come over that whole week and bring all of that food, and they would have this huge potluck for the week. Get rid of the food, head back home. The reason I was not as familiar with closing up the cottage ideas is because we needed our food and our pantry. There was a great thing with the socialization that happened there. So there were people who were resorters, who were property owners that did participate in some of that. But these are some of the things that, as you see, there's a full richness in terms of activities, social connections, and even if you look around hunting, both bow and gun are huge. It is another season in Idlewild during that time. So if you do, come on, you can see us.
Do you remember our first trip up to Idlewild?
Yes,
What's the advice?
I bought vests. I bought orange vests.
Oh yes. Yeah, no,
I'm serious.
Yeah.
I brought them.
Yeah.
I didn't want to be out in the woods, and it's firearm season, and there was hunting going on, right? And so we were looking at historic properties, and that's all.
And I do want to say, so I grew up November 15th. If it was a school day, at least a quarter of the school children would be out that day, if not more, because we were hunting. They were hunting.
And that's not just an Idlewild thing. That's just a Michigan incident.
Right,
Like if you're going to go up north and walk in the woods in December,
You will wear orange.
yeah.
Be seen. It is still me. So there are, I'm assuming I'm talking about current renovations. So there are a number of things that have been going on, and a number of people. Like historically, I had to write notes because I didn't want to forget anybody, and I'm going to forget people, but there were things like the University of Michigan. They came and did some renovations. They actually did a tour around Michigan, and Idlewild was included in that tour. They did about 5 buildings. After that, because they didn't finish all of their things, my brother-in-law and a few other locals got together and formed a community day. So what we did was we got together and we finished those projects and added a few more to the list. This past summer, one of the foremost scholars on Idlewild, Ron Stevens, was doing talks at the Historic and Cultural Center every Saturday, which was profound both for visitors and for home folks. There's so many organizations that are there now. Yates for Progress, which is a community organizing both political and tangible organization that has some significant things. Some Idlewild community collaboratives. That's a parachurch, a church, and a social organization group getting together to hear the ideas of the people and to say how can we act upon them. Historic HIPS, Historic Idlewild Preservation Society. They're looking at conservation and specifically some of the cultural icons in terms of buildings that they're using. But I can't leave out John Meeks and Evelyn Descott, Gloria Fikes, Nana J. Bagley, Bellamy and Mitchell, Evans and Matus, Lindsay. Those are people who came up and gave their 401ks, as I say, or retirements, right, to restore Idlewild. And I used to think I needed to wait till I retire to do that same thing. Never did I imagine that I would be the town historian this early in my life. What's happening in the future? Can I go there right now? Not yet.
Before you do that, CJ, we just absolutely love this photo of you down in Casablanca with the current owners. Could you share a little bit about the story of Casablanca and what got you involved in this particular restoration?
Absolutely. So, the last time that Casablanca was used was probably 1976, and it was not a hotel. It actually was a daycare center. And so I was one of the last inhabitants of the Casablanca before it would Stillwater, or whatever it's called. Sorry, I made a wrong analogy. Before it closed. There's a group of John Meeks. I mentioned John. Actually before John, Dr. America Nelson, who's in there, and her father, Lorenzo Nelson, and mother, Blanche Nelson, purchased it in anticipation of restoring her to her beauty. Now, in 1955, I didn't talk about it. The Chicago Defender talked about it, and it was one other newspaper that talked about the Casablanca and said it was the country's premier hotel. Now, I wasn't born, so I don't know. What I do know is everybody who stayed there and everybody I know who went through there talked about its elegance, talked about they had been to New York. They weren't allowed in some of those places, but they had seen them, and they had not seen anything like the Casablanca. It is now being with this at least third iteration of people who want to restore it. It is not being restored. They just received a grant from the National, help me out? National Historic Trust. And one of the first things they did was an environmental scan of it, right? Because they wanted to make sure it was solid and so they could do some renovations. This project actually was a documentary. I don't remember. I've done 2 documentaries in here. I think that one was the one that was talking about paranoid activity. You need to know that I was livid when they even called me. I said, Idlewild is not and has never been a ghost town. Don't get it twisted because you see dilapidated houses that it is ghost. It's not. It's actually people wanting to hold on to property and their children, either they don't have children or their children don't want it and they don't want to sell it because they don't want to make sure that Idlewild becomes like some other resorts, non-accessible to the historical and preservers of the historic and cultural iconicness of it. So I was a little leery to even connect with him, but I did. And he said, well, we want to hear that perspective. And so I think we went in there. I don't know if they saw any ghosts. I didn't see any ghosts. But what I did share with them of how this place was a place for nurture for me, after it had welcomed hundreds and thousands of people over those years, for me as a child, I have memories of its nurture. I have memories of its care. I have memories of its teaching me about who I was and whose I was. So that's what this building meant to me. It was happenstance that I even got a chance to be in it. I was born at the right time, or maybe not. Maybe I should have been born earlier so I could have stayed in there, like overnight. But what I had to identify with them is There's no ghost here. If there are ghosts here, what it is the spirit of the ancestors reminding us that this cultural icon, this cultural place, this sacred space ought to be, should be, and must be preserved to share the story and to share the world. Okay.
That's beautiful, CJ. Now next to it is another special building that nurtured you and that you have a special hand in. And I think that's another story to share.
Okay, a brief story. The Yates Township School Number 4, the Idlewild Library, the Idlewild Township Hall was vacated in 2014, and they moved the township and the library to its current location on Nelson Road, which left this building, which for me was not the school that my brother-in-law attended, or that Mother Betty attended, or that Dr. America Nelson attended, but for me it was a place of cultural esteeming. I run a business, Kingdom Grier Associates, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Coaching and Consulting. And people ask me, where do you get this from? And I said, from Julia Thomas, from watching Bruce Lee on Saturday mornings. I'm a baby of the 70s, so I don't know if there's enough of us in here for that. For macrame and for loomed pot holders, for painting ceramic figurines, and for understanding what it means to be unapologetically Black, and what it means that this richness that we had in the poorest county in Michigan at that time, and the fourth poorest county in the nation at that time, that did not describe who we were and or who we could become. Julia Thomas and the cohort of women and men who nurtured us on Saturday morning and throughout the evenings, after school programs, they were the ones in this building that provided in that era, in that the 2 decades, the 70s and 80s, a nurturing and a formation that was second to none. It was drill sergeant and it was love. In December of 2021, the township gifted this to me in that I said, listen, I've got this huge collection and I'd like somewhere to put it, and I tried to connect with someplace else that it probably should go, and they weren't interested in partnering at the time, and we've got this empty building. They said, sure, let's give it to you. And I said, no. I said, the reason I don't want you to give it to me is because the township has to have some connection. It is incumbent upon you to have some ownership of the history of Yates Township and Idlewild. And they agreed, and so we partnered in that, and I'm waiting to get some renovations done to do that. But that's what this building has done.
Thank you, CJ. We look forward to the day when you're going to open the doors and welcome us all in.
Yes.
And share about the history of the place itself too, but the many generations who entered and graduated from those doors.
That's right.
And so we've touched a little bit about, hotels, places of accommodation. We talked about civic buildings. What you see up there is also a cottage, which is another type of building and architectural type. And that itself has another story, and I'm wondering if our friends over there, Anna and Nick, can lean into that and share a bit more about the significance for that house.
So that house shown, can you hear me? Is this on? That's the Charles Waddell Chestnut house home. And Charles Waddell Chestnut was a prominent Black author who lived in this cottage. And this cottage is a really fine example of the kinds of cottages that would have been seen along the shoreline in I would say the first half of that period of significance. And so it's a rustic, basic construction cottage, but it's a cottage, right? It's got all the amenities that one needs to summer there on the lake. It's got a more prominent sort of composition that faces the lake, and so when you're on the water, you're seeing lots more architectural composition. But these little cottages are really charming. They're really lovely. They're of a nice scale, and as you drive around kind of meandering roads that are kind of, they meander because the shoreline is meandering. You're encountering these cottages in these little clusters, and they're in this forested setting, right? This is like this. There's not a whole lot of undergrowth, so it's mostly just canopy, but it's pines and oaks and things like that. And so it's this. That's a great example of the kind of atmosphere that you can encounter there at the lake.
He says meandering, and let me give you some specific language. Before it was Idlewild Lake, it was called Crooked Lake for a reason. Look it up on the map.
I would say I'm familiar with lots of lakes up in like the upper half of the mitten, being from Michigan, and I used to go up to a place that's on one of the maps that we saw as a kid, and a lot of them are just kind of round, you know, or they might have like a dog leg in them or something. These lakes are really remarkable. Both the lakes at Idlewild and at Woodland Park have this meandering shoreline that creates all kinds of interesting vistas where peninsulas are jetting out into the water and framing views, and you see these little promontories with pine trees on them. And it's just a really unique natural character that actually surprised me as somebody who's quite familiar with cottaging up there. I was really struck by the landforms. I think the Woodland Park Lake, there's like a piece of ice, right? There's like a leftover piece of ice in the glaciers, and it melted and left that landform, but really unique for that area, actually.
You can take it to the next slide. This summer, prompted by this, thank you. I actually created a 33-boat tour that I'm excited to debut next year. So, look.
Before we move on from the lakes, because you guys are from Michigan, I know you know these lakes, or I assume that you know some lakes somewhere. Very clear water. We walked down these docks, and all I ever saw when I was a kid was people just pouring chemicals into the lake to fend off, you know, all the muck and all the, you know, lily pads or whatever they were trying to kill, and then fertilizer running in and just fueling, you know, all this invasive species and plant growth and things. It was a constant battle to create this sense of like a real beach, and you're battling against nature. And when we visited these lakes, it's like this, you know, clear, crystal clear water with this like peaceful dock that goes out, and just you see this pebbles on the bottom of the lake. So that's just FYI. These are really good lakes.
But that's also something important as part of the stewardship paradigm, right? There is the environmental stewardship, which is also very present in the minds of the two communities that we serve. And in the process of doing the community planning, that's emerged as a theme as well, in addition to the cultural as well as the historic resources. But one of the biggest kind of observations that we had was really the way in which, at least for Idlewild, how it unfolded in terms of the local as well as the state level stewardship. As we went through the last 10, 20 years or so, there was such an interesting shift in that the first catalyst came from the state in terms of recognizing its significance. But in the last 10 years, it started to shift more to the locals. And the reason why people like CJ, the reason why Colleen, who was the former Yates Township Supervisor and Lake County Commissioner, she's the one who now owns the Charles Chestnut Rubble Home. It takes a lot of local effort to start moving some of these pieces forward, and it takes a lot of patience. We talk about patient capital here. This takes it to a whole other level of working with the community and working with the state as well as the local initiatives. And so on that note, as we look at how things have shifted, one of the things that came to mind as well is in the most recent effort, we certainly, from our team, we're not the only ones. We're building on a foundation of many other efforts. And with that, I wonder if Anna and Nick can share a little bit more about the work that we did for Idlewild, but also its sister community, Woodland Park.
Want me to take that over, Nick? All right. So, like Har Ye said, it's not just us. In both communities, we've been working with work groups, which are made up of the individuals who live in this community, both of these communities who have the passion. And I mean, CJ's on one of the work groups himself. And so that's where we are learning, that's where we're listening, that's where we're hearing what is going to be the best strategy forward for each of these communities. And this project was sort of brought to us as one, and it very quickly became two. And by that I mean that Idlewild and Woodland Park, while they have their similarities, they also have their differences. They're very different places that share a common history and common goals, but are in different places and have different means to getting to what their goals are. So that's why it was really beneficial to have these two work groups to really be able to listen. And so from there, we just listened to what things were they looking for. Idlewild, we definitely heard about making the history, the places sort of more present, bringing it to the youth, bringing it to new business owners, creating more interest on that level. In Woodland Park, they're not yet listed on the National Register of Historic Places. They are very, very interested in pursuing a nomination. They kind of look up to Idlewild. They see what Idlewild has, and they would like to be represented on that national stage as well. Even beyond that, just having a more sort of formal approach to the preservation in Woodland Park. And so you can see there's our very similar goals, but ones that come from different places. And so, as part of this whole outreach process, we held events in the communities. So what you're seeing here are photographs from the summer, both in Woodland Park and at Idlewild. It was really important for us because, again, we're not from here, from there, we're from here, to be involved, for them to see our faces, to be able to approach us, to be able to share what we have been learning, and then to gather that information from them. We did a questionnaire in both communities, gathering information about historic preservation, about their thoughts and feelings on the past, but also on the present and what they'd like to see in the future. And going through this, it's been very interesting to, again, see the through lines that come through, and then also what is important to each area. And so by having these outreach events, I guess we could say, in person, allowed us to also have those discussions verbally and to reach an audience that perhaps would have been more difficult. So, anything else?
Yeah, I would just say the pictures from these days were really fun. We were welcomed very warmly in both communities, and they were long days, but we gathered a lot of information. But it was just it was really a privilege. We had a good weather day. People were out, doing recreational things, and so we got a lot. We got our money's worth on that day. That was a lot of fun.
Actually, and I'm not even sure if you are, this just came to me, which is why I was trying to look it up. In 21, these communities kind of came together. They have a gathering, which we call the Wildwood. Right? The two sister communities. And so it's 2 days of events. It's usually a social in the evening time at the local bars. And one night is Idlewild, the other night is in Woodland Park. So, did you all go to last?
No.
Okay.
We don't go. We received a t-shirt from Wildwood, which was really special. But this notion of the two communities traveling to each other continues that practice of what was in the past. In the past, there was a special shuttle bus that would take families, kids, teenagers from Woodland Park to Idlewild, where they would skate in the rink. They can't go to the nightclubs, but they were able to hang out in other places. And then that same bus would safely take them back home to Woodland Park and vice versa.
Yeah, and Har Ye, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about this process and how it includes going to an event like this, setting up a little pop-up booth with our questionnaires and our mapping exercises and things like that. But also, it goes beyond that because it goes online, right? So there was a whole collection effort of gathering survey input from people who weren't there that day, but as a sort of overarching effort to make sure that we were capturing.
Right, one of the things that we did, and in fact we kind of did in the inverse order, usually in a lot of community outreach events, we would do the outreach first, before we do any planning, before we do any drawing. This was one project where we actually did the listening and the outreach for the broader community last. And one of the reasons was because we were all very conscious of how there was so much history and so much local knowledge that we all needed to get up to speed on to actually build relationships with CJ, with the rest of the work group, not just in one community, it was two communities. Two communities with very different dynamics, and for us to actually gain their trust. Trust is so important in such a process. It's something where we want to honor them, but for them to feel comfortable enough so that even though we don't look like them, they're able to open up their hearts to us, they're able to open up their histories, their stories, and to know that we will take good care of what they share with us and put it forward in a meaningful way that truly respects their values, where they want to go as they balance their identity both in the past, present, and future, but also balancing preservation in terms of history and environment, but also some of the economic interest, right, that's coming through the right place, that's coming through from a very well-intentioned place to ensure that there is financial viability. And so it's simply one where knowing that this is a national network, CJ talked about the Detroit Idlewilders, the Chicago Idlewilders. Not everybody goes to Idlewild at the same time. They go at different waves, and so one of the ways in which we wanted to reach also the younger generation was going online, so that folks all the way from Arkansas, from Florida, from New Jersey, could then give us their thoughts and share their views, even if we don't necessarily meet them in person. So it's quite an extensive process, but it's something one that we hope can provide a way in which engagement can be thought of for these communities that have such extensive geographical, multi-generational networks.
I know some of you all are looking for the tidbits of cultural stuff, so I'm going to give it to you. Common Ground Woodland Park. I'm sorry for touching you. Yvonne Woodard. Now, that's just a name. You don't know Yvonne. I know Yvonne. Yvonne was a profound woman, intelligent woman. I wanted to interview her when I was a teacher at the public schools in Baldwin. And I said, I want to interview you. I want to VHS interview you on your brother. And she looked at me and she said, I can do that, but I have my own story. She said, I'm a double survivor of breast cancer. She was the owner of the grocery store, the convenience store there, right across from the main beach area, and just a pillar in the community. Unfortunately, I did a lot of talking, got a lot of information, but never did the interview before she passed. That's Malcolm X's sister. So his people and her people are still there. Stephen and Dad Jones, all of those are Malcolm's people, his DNA. And so I want to say that this was more than, there are more jewels that you don't even know about, that I don't talk about because I don't have time. I will when it comes to it.
And so on that note, we also want to acknowledge what are some of the triumphs and challenges, and I think this question is probably best posed to CJ. CJ, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you've seen through the 20 plus years of planning processes, you've seen different people come and go, you've seen state-led efforts, local efforts. What to you are some of the highlights? What was most successful and what was most challenging?
Collaboration was always the most successful. You cannot do this work and be a lone ranger. I have some people who say, how do you fool with her or with him? And I say, this is bigger than me. It's bigger than any project I have. I said, Idlewild to me has been everything. She has raised and nurtured me. What good can come from Nazareth? I used to say, what good can come from Idlewild? Right? The first poorest in Michigan, fourth poorest in the county. And then, so collaboration. The second thing I think is recognizing who holds the true power. There are people who are silent, but they speak and they are gatekeepers, right? You know those people, and in your own context, right? At work, in your family, right? You know those people, and so it's important to get a perspective on who those people are and how you might listen to their wisdom, right? The third thing I think the challenge is to, Holland was so good to me over these past 26 years. What you taught me was that it was okay to be culturally specific. You taught me that I could be unapologetically black. Not apologize at all. You know how you taught me that? By having my children out of school 2 days and wearing Dutch costumes. By having a visitor conventions bureau, which does a profound job bringing in millions of dollars every year. You taught me that it was okay to be culturally specific. And so that's another piece that people are coming to. They're like, well, are we gonna lose? Is gentrification gonna happen? Are they gonna come in here with all this money and make it something that we don't recognize? So you've taught me, those are some of the challenges and triumphs, right? Harlem. Can I go to Harlem? Is it okay if I go to Harlem? Some parts of Harlem don't look like the historical Harlem. So does that mean that white people can't come to Idlewild? I'm just naming an elephant in the room. We didn't discuss this, but I'm calling it out. Does that mean that white people can't come to Idlewild? Absolutely not. Even historically, Idlewild was a safe space for all. Its purpose was to entertain. Its purpose was to provide a place of relaxation and rest, right? And so, and the people at home, wherever home was, unless it was there, knew what exclusion felt like. So why would they want to in turn do that to other people? For what reason? That doesn't make it, in our concept and understanding, it didn't make sense. Are you a restaurant? Then feed me. Are you a lodging place? Then make my bed, turn my bed back, and put the mint on the pillow, please. So, what does that mean? No, it doesn't mean that white people can't come there, but it does mean this. It means that when you come there and you buy property, you figure out what are the things that are important to the cultural and historical essence of the place. And how does my presence or my purse hinder that? Or how does my presence and my purse help that?
CJ, on that point, I noticed that when we were talking with the planning groups, people would own a parcel or they would own a cottage, and they didn't use the word own. They said, I steward this cottage, or I steward these parcels. So that attitude is very much facilitated by what you're talking about.
Because this is not our property. Literally, I mean, it's mine now because my name is on the deed, but it was Robert Riff, one of the first black owners' property. And then it was my mother and father's property. And guess what? It will be my children and my nieces and nephews' property. So it's absolutely that concept. So what does that mean? It means that I have to make sure that my children know the story. It means that I have to make sure that my nieces and nephew are able to experience what they experienced at grandma's house in the 80s and 90s, so that they can take that and share with their children and their sphere. And they are. And that's what it means. Those are some of the challenges and triumphs.
And that's also a great segue in terms of where do we go from here, because it's future oriented and it's about your children, your grandchildren, and those to come. So with that, Anna, I'm wondering if you and Nick can help us and share a little bit more about what is to come for Idlewild coming through for our little process, as well as some of the other elements of the pandemic.
Yeah, so it's hard to follow that up, but I will I'll try my best. So through this process, we were able to gain the understanding that there are a number of places that aren't recognized at the same level. So we talked about historic markers and what places in Idlewild are known. And then we learned there's a lot of places that are unknown, or they're not unknown to the folks who live there, to call this area home, but they're not shared in the public space like some of the others are. So that led to the two maps you're seeing here. Places that would be great examples or places for reuse and revitalization, and then additionally locations for future historic markers and additional interpretive panels. CJ, did you want to add something? It looked like you were going to say something. No? Okay. Nick?
Yeah, if you go back to that, with the posters, Anna hit on something of reuse and revitalize versus preserve. And part of our work is to try to figure out where is that line for a given parcel and start to disposition properties for one of those two directions. So the things that really need to be preserved, maybe in a state that is their current state or some interpretive state, and then the parcels that need to be stewarded for sure, but they might need some reinvention. They might need to be revitalized using some fresh ideas. And we don't draw that line. That line gets drawn by input from the community members. But it's setting up that conversation and then establishing what does it mean for this community when we use the word preserve? What does it mean when we use the word reuse or revitalize? And that's kind of where the work starts to really connect with the original scope of the project, which, as we mentioned, was economic development, really. So after all of that work, where does it become appropriate to start having some targets for economic development, some plausible locations and resources for economic development?
You know, one of the things that you stay here, one of the things that is always talked about, and when I'm ever invited into conversations, I always say, if it is still the second poorest county in Michigan, what then does mining the essence of the people who are there and who maintain the land between the summer, what does it mean to invest or pull out of them their essence in such a way that it is not only marketable but financially lucrative for them, so that they're already stewarding as best they can? What would it look like to be creative in thinking, how can we make sure that not only Coca-Cola makes money, but they do? That's one of the also pitfalls, right? We had a youth prison. That's not going to be a topic, I promise you. We had a youth prisoner come in there, level 5, maximum level 5, not to Idlewild, but nearby. And one of the things were how many of the locals going to have jobs, and there was some promise, and I'm not sure it didn't aspire to what they said or what the people had hoped. But it's the sample that I want to use. What does it mean to do economic development in terms of human capital? And specifically, what would it profit you to go in and restore the flamingo, and then Mother Betty is still not making ends meet? Is there some way that is going to be the nuance? And when I am concerned, that will always be on the table unapologetically.
Yeah, and the UNESCO
That's right.
and other documents address that completely head on by saying the people who are the owners of this particular cultural heritage, whatever it might be, are the ones who must profit, must be at the table, but also must profit when economic development is happening.
That doesn't mean that you can't profit, because I know there's some checks in the room. I want to say that, right? Because I know some people's purpose is to make more money with their money. And so I want to be I want to say that clearly. That doesn't mean you also can't benefit and or profit. It does mean, what does stewardship of your resources to their resources look like?
When you're talking about profiting, right, and profiting for the local stakeholders and then profiting for external new stakeholders, it's another kind of collaboration. As long as it takes on that spirit, it could probably work, right? But it needs to be thought of in that way.
Absolutely.
Okay. So what you're looking at here is Woodland Park, not Idlewild. But you can see the shape of the lake, going back to what Nick and CJ were saying earlier. It's beautiful. So what you're also, yep. What you're also seeing here is the outline for the proposed historic district in Woodland Park. It's that center, it's a little difficult to see with the contrast. And something I'd just like to point out are also the arrows. Those are showing the gateways, the entrances into town. So when thinking about sort of the future and revitalization and preservation in these spaces, we've really had to narrow in our focus because of the scope of this project. We would have loved to have surveyed and studied all of Woodland Park, and we had to choose a very specific area. But this is the area that welcomes people to the community. It's where Yvonne's Common Ground is. It's sort of the central place. It's where the schoolhouse is located. And so that's the area that's being represented on the map you're seeing right there.
This is just a really quick snapshot of the things that are out there to be taken advantage of, whether it's programs or entities that are concerned with conservation and preservation, or entities that seem like they could be good allies to projects in the future. The idea here is simply to cast a pretty wide net where we look at what could be out there to be leveraged and to be pursued in the future. Not everything's a perfect fit, but lots of these have lots of programs folded under them, and something could be a good fit. And then some of them here are also not necessarily resources as much as they are frameworks to do further analysis. So like the Cultural Landscape Foundation, for example, offers best practices and frameworks for documentation. Har Ye, do you want to talk a little bit about the cultural landscape, like that aspect of these projects and how that's sort of come into some of our work when we talk about surveying in historic districts?
Right, happy to do that, and also to use that as a way of bringing this to almost maybe a close. One of the things that really struck us as one of the things that we wrestled with, as you might have heard CJ, Anna, and Nick talk about, is historic preservation and getting onto the National Register of Historic Places tends to focus on buildings, on structures. What's unique about these two communities are also their settings. The lakes, the forests, the elements of the drive, the beach, what happens on the water and away from the water. And so the Cultural Landscape Foundation itself is a lens in which to start looking and appreciating and highlighting some of these landscape elements so that they then too can be considered as part of a more holistic understanding of why it is historically significant, why they are different from urban places, and how they also constitute to the need to protect them for the future. So we have looked at a variety of interpretive markers, and these are some possibilities that Anna has prepared and has actually done in places like Saugatuck, so go check it out. But these are ways in which the education and the future generation can continue to be informed about the history of a place and a variety of ways in which it can be done. And so stepping back out and really looking at the national network and what this all means and kind of the national histories that we're trying to honor is one in which, as we come to the close of not just this exhibit, this particular discussion and conversation, is that there are many other African American communities, historic communities and places that are so worthy of our recognition, of our protection. And what we just shared is just a tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more work to be done, and one that will now leave CJ to close out on a community that he got to know, and then we'll pivot it over to you, and you can ask all the questions that you want.
Looking at Michelle. Okay. There have been a number of people in the 40 and 50-year-olds recently who have come back and invested both in Idlewild and in Woodland Park. So I think of Attorney Floyd Brown, who I went to school with. I think of Andre Nichols. I think of retired NBA from the Timberwolves, Reggie Fox. Again, I grew up with all of them, literally grew up with all of them. And they've come back at this time to infuse their financial resources into purchasing land, purchasing homes, renovating homes, increasing the number of vacation spots that people could come to rent in terms of Airbnb and bed and breakfasts. And it has just been great to watch them and these other organizations. 365 is as you can imagine, the ones that stay there. They put on, opposite my family's historical music festival, but the 4th of July Saturday, we put on a music festival. My mother who passed a few years ago, and they put on one on the island. It's attended by hundreds of people, both of them. So again, there are these organizations, these people who have come back to, right, because people are always saying, well, what are the locals doing? I can give you about 50 different, at least off the top of my head, 50 different ways that people who've been nurtured, who've grown up, historical Idlewild Tours, a touring company. Again, she grew up there, Makayla, and she has created a business for that. There are a number of ways that we've done that. I'm finished. Because y'all have to ask questions, and so, all right, thank you.
Well, first I want to say, on behalf of the Holland Museum and all of us here, thank you to Anna and Nick and CJ and Har Ye. It's amazing how such an exciting and inspiring project, and honestly, we can't wait to see what the future holds for the amazing Idlewild community. So we're just excited to see what happens. So thank you all for being here. Yes, we do want to spend a few minutes on some questions. I will share this microphone with anyone who has a question. You all can share that one up there for the answers. But does anyone have any questions? You were all so thorough. Oh, wait a moment. Oh, someone over there. Okay, I'm coming.
What is the current population of Idlewild and Woodland Park? Each population.
That's always, and I should know that as the historian. I'm not the Census Bureau, right? I don't know Woodland Park. Do you know Woodland Park? Oh, well, I'm gonna give it over to the doctor. She knows. I can tell you about Idlewild, but doctors.
No, the doctor, the data key.
No, okay, all right.
And this is just census based on the township in which they're located. Woodland Park is in Merrill Township, and Merrill Township has a year-round residence of about 520 people. Yates Township, now Idlewild is split between Yates Township and a different township. In Yates Township alone, Pleasant Plains Township. Yeah. Okay. Well, Yates Township census is approximately 770, but that doesn't represent, right, all of the people who come to Idlewild.
And that's why I always hesitate when I ask that question, because year-round, there are about 700 people, but even that, people who are working from home, right, a bunch of people are, they come up if they've got good Wi-Fi. They come up and do work there. Kurt comes up and does work there. A number of people do their work up in Idlewild during that time, during the year. So fall and even winter when they want to have a winter wonderland. So, but 700 is what the census about gives. Much higher in the summer, absolutely much higher, at least double if not triple that.
Other questions?
Okay, one of the questions that I've been to all the talks that has kind of struck me is, how is security handled up there? And over the years and going forward, and with all of the issues with police and African Americans and all of that, how has that played out?
That's a great question. So again, I'm giving you Chris Grier's answer. I want to be crystal clear about that. Has there been strife? Yes. Historically, it's not been around race. It has been around individual pieces. The current chair, it's been, I'm gonna get in trouble from some people by saying this. It's actually been very good compared to some other incidents around the nation. I'll say that. The second thing I'll say is even the current sheriff is intentional about collecting cash from people and using that money to supply gifts to nonprofits from $500 to $2,000, like monthly. And if you look at the newspaper, the Lake County Star, and you look at all the ones, it's absolutely right. There is no discrimination. As a matter of fact, it probably is about 50-50 with people of various races, black and white, who have been getting the grants. Again, are there some issues? Yeah, but I would not say historically they have been racist. As a matter of fact, Idlewild Township used to have its own constable, used to have it had a number of different sheriffs, and yeah, that might also be looked at coming up soon. But yes, so yeah. Did that answer your question?
Any additional questions? As I said, you all were so thorough. So thank you all for being here this evening, and again, thank you again to our panelists, and we'll give you one more round of applause. It looks like you've got one more thing to add.
I think
Just one thing to add to the question of policing. When we were up there, we never felt it was unsafe. It always felt like the community knew each other, people knew each other, that you're always in the presence of friends who watch out for your backs. And the same goes for property. Neighbors actually look out for neighbors' property, and sometimes when they know that you're not in town, or when you're back in Grenville or Grand Rapids, you have one other neighbor telling you, hey, there's something up at your property, or something's happening at the parcel right next to you. And so there's always a sense of community that's watching out for each other, even when you don't have the police around.
that's absolutely true. I remember my next door neighbor calling saying, somebody's in your house, and I don't know them. I said, yes, that's correct. That's my cousin from Cleveland, and he should be there.
I just remember feeling a little bit less safe on the way home. We stopped for food, and it was just like we were out of this bubble of just community, and it was such a pleasant day that we had, you know, with, we were in Idlewild, and it was in Woodland Park. But yeah, I agree with you. We didn't feel unsafe when we were there, and we felt very safe when we were there.
All right, thank you all again for being here this evening. Thank you. Remember, you have till October 23rd to see the Idlewild exhibit, and thank you all for being here, and have a good night.